Evening from God's Word. In verse 5 and 6 of Isaiah chapter 33, there's a moment where he gives us an interesting thought. He says in verse 5, "The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness. Wisdom and knowledge will be the stability of your times. And the strength of salvation, the fear of the Lord, is his treasure." I want to focus on that idea this morning of wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of your times. I suppose all of us are looking for some stability once in a while. When life seems to be somewhat unstable, sometimes life seems to be a bit shaky for us. And so we have to remember that there is a source by which that stability can come. There is a means by which that we can have stability. And the writer here illustrates for us that it is the wisdom and knowledge that comes from God that allows us to have that. Let me give you a quick historical perspective on what's going on up until this moment where this statement is made here in Isaiah chapter 33. And first I want you to remember that Judas had faced extremely difficult times in this moment. They were in unstable times, and God is commending them and encouraging them to realize stability can come if they would focus upon the wisdom and knowledge that would come from God. Assyria was swiftly advancing from the north, and anytime you've got an enemy at the door, it can be quite concerning to a nation. Some wanted to surrender over to them and just kind of get it over with, and maybe they felt that that would be the proper path to take, while yet others wanted to make a deal with Egypt to come up and maybe help protect them in the midst of this challenge. But Isaiah encouraged them to do neither of those two things. Isaiah is trying to encourage them to stay the course with God and allow for him to provide the stability. You know, when we find ourselves in unstable moments, when we find ourselves on shaky ground, we tend to look for answers. We tend to try to find some kind of help from some source. And the challenge that we have before us is that we must be very cautious that we don't choose the wrong source. It may have seemed plausible to them to ask for Egypt to come up and help. Let's make an allegiance with them. But that really wasn't going to be very beneficial to them, because they would only have become beholden to Egypt because of it. They could have surrendered to Assyria, but that really wasn't in God's plan either, and would not have brought the benefit that they had sought. Their only real hope was to look to God and the wisdom and knowledge that he was providing for them to carry them through the difficult time. When we find ourselves on shaky ground, when you and I find ourselves in unstable times, be careful what source you choose to find stability. Be careful where it is you and I are looking for help. And most certainly the first and obvious choice we should make as God's children is to look to the Father for the wisdom and knowledge that he grants unto us. So exactly how was the Lord going to be a stabilizer? How was he going to provide wisdom and knowledge that would lead them to this more stable environment they were seeking? So let's look at a couple other texts. Let's look over in Job chapter 14. Back into the book of Job. Job chapter 14. You remember, I don't have to recount the whole history of Job. If I did, you'd still be here at the start of Kevin's lesson tonight when we got done. But let me just give you a brief thought here to remind you that you talk about somebody who went through some unstabling times. You talk about a man who had some events and occurrences in his life that not just one thing would shake him, but while he's still shaking from the first thing that happens, the next thing happens. And while he's shaking even more from that, the next comes. And as you've heard me say before, I don't know whether I would have opened the door to the next messenger if another one had showed up in the days of Job, because they continued to have bad news at every turn. But I want you to notice that he said in verse 1 of chapter 14 of Job, "Man who was born of woman is of few days and full of trouble." Now, what an encouraging thought that is, right? You know, sometimes you have to state the reality in order for folks to realize that there's help in the midst of that reality. I don't know that he's simply trying to be dark and bleak, although the book of Job is that in many ways because of the difficulties that he's experiencing. But sometimes you've got to be honest about the reality so that you'll then look for the benefit and help that can carry you through that reality. You know, the first process or the first stage, maybe in a sense, of finding help in times of trouble is to admit you're in trouble. You know, that's the hardest part maybe. You know, sometimes we are reluctant because if we admit we're in trouble, if we admit we're unstable, if we admit there's some challenge that I'm facing that has me shaking in relationship to my faith, that's a sign of weakness, right? I can't admit that. It's like politics. It drives you crazy, right? Because no one can ever admit they did anything wrong because they believe that will show them as weak and their opponents will attack and create greater challenges for them. And we get into that mindset as well, even in a personal level, where we assume that if I ever admit I'm weak, then I won't have the same persona that I once did. We might as well face the fact. Every man born of woman is a few days and full of trouble in many occasions in that path. There are lots of things that challenge, hinder, create troubles and problems for us. And the first step of honesty will then help me look to how to create some stability in the midst of that reality. So how does he do it? Well, he said with wisdom and knowledge. Let's look at a couple of texts. Let's start in the Proverbs. Let's look at Proverb 2 in verse 6 beginning. Proverb 2, verse 6. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk uprightly. He guards the paths of justice and preserves the way of his saints. And then you will understand righteousness and justice, equity, and every good path. Pause for a moment. So the wisdom and knowledge that God is providing, he says, gives us some equity and it gives us some stability in finding the right path in which to take. Decision making and choices come fast and furiously in life. And sometimes you don't always have as much time as you would like to be determining which path that I should take, because life sometimes comes at us very quickly. And so the more of God's wisdom and knowledge that I put into my heart and mind, the more I store up into my memory bank, the more readily available those thoughts and that wisdom and that guidance will be to me when I've got to make a decision. I can go to that memory bank. I can go to that store of thought, that knowledge that God has shared with me, and use it in the moment that I'm in. And so the more I know about God's justice, the more I know about his righteousness, the more I know about the wisdom and knowledge that he has offered up and store up this sound wisdom for the upright, the better I'll be in those choices and moments that I find myself in. Notice verse 10. When wisdom enters your heart, and knowledge is pleasant to your soul. I'm going to put on the brakes quicker now. But I want you to stop for a moment here. When wisdom enters your heart and knowledge is pleasant to your soul. A lot of times we stay in instability because we don't like the method God is educating me to create stability. Sometimes it's not pleasant. Sometimes the answer seems in the moment harder than the question was. What am I going to do in that moment? What am I going to do in that moment when the answer God's providing, the path that he is saying, this is the right, this is where righteousness leads you. And that path seems more difficult and more challenging than that, when it doesn't seem as pleasant. What am I going to do? I've got to begin to realize that even though there may be a difficulty or a challenge in the path that God has chosen, that it's ultimately always for my benefit and good. And so I would consider it pleasant in my soul. Discretion will preserve you. Understanding will keep you. To deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. Wisdom and knowledge helps me stay stable because it keeps me away from the unstable when it comes to sinful choices and paths. Maintaining my relationship with God and remaining within his wisdom and the knowledge that he provides allows for me to stay stable because it keeps me away from those things that cause instability in my life. Again, I have to be honest with that. Verse 15, whose ways are crooked and who are devious in their paths, to deliver you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. It's an interesting specific that he uses to illustrate the generic here. But the point is clear that we have to be very cautious and use the wisdom and guidance that God has provided, because there are all kinds of options out here and lots of folks persuading us into paths that will create greater instability to us. So be careful. Because verse 22 simply says, the wicked will be cut off from the earth and the unfaithful will be uprooted from it. God provides wisdom and knowledge and guidance. He teaches us what righteous paths are. He gives us a storage wealth of knowledge and wisdom that we might find stability if we'll turn to Him. Go to chapter 3, the book of Proverbs, verse 21. My son, let them not depart from your eyes. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so they will be life to your soul and grace to your neck. They are life to your soul. The truth is, some things you cannot control on the outside. There are some physical calamities that are completely and totally out of your control. There are some physical things that happen to folks that they didn't do anything to cause. They didn't create any kind of problem on their own. It just happens. Sickness and disease, challenges that create some instability in our lives. But the one thing I can control, even in the midst of those physical calamities, is where my soul and where my heart and where my mind is. And so long as I still have my right mind, so long as I still have the ability to think and to consider and to meditate and to ponder and to use the intellect God has given me, He says, let sound wisdom fill your life and your soul, and let it be grace to your neck. Then you will walk safely in your way, and your foot will not stumble. We can't always control what's going on in our physical lives. But we can gain some emotional and faith stability if we focus our thoughts and our intents and our hearts and our minds upon the wisdom of God. And sometimes it may be the only thing we do have control over. You know, I always try to encourage folks to recognize that sin came into this world and caused a lot of problems. When man decided to choose to sin, he brought not only a spiritual death, but he brought a physical death as well. Sin created calamity for man, and it has been a problem ever since. And because that sin entered, physical death entered into the equation. And with physical death came physical sickness and health and challenges that affect our health and difficulties that people have from the day Adam and Eve chose to forsake the law of God. The process began. And I simply say to encourage you and encourage myself that I cannot control all things that are set in motion because of physical death that is ultimate for all of us. But what I can control is the way I think. And I will not let Satan rob me of both. Through the deceitfulness of sin, he set in motion the physical death that comes. And he set the spiritual death in motion. There's only one of those two that I ultimately have control over. The only one of those two that I can have some very direct say in is my spiritual health. Don't let Satan rob you of both. We're going to have some physical problems in our lives. Ultimately, all of us will die or see the Lord return. And along that path, there are going to be a lot of physical challenges that Satan's going to use against you to try to deny your faith in the process. Satan will use them to discourage you away from God. Satan will do everything he can to use the physical side to discourage you from the spiritual side. Don't give him the satisfaction of winning both in your life. Use the wisdom and guidance that comes from God. And stay fervent in your relationship with him. And deny Satan the satisfaction of both having victory over physical death and also your spiritual health. Go to James chapter 1, verse 5. I want to ask you a question about this text. I know you've read this text. You've probably studied the book of James 3 or 4 times. We studied the book of James here when I was a kid. In my 20s, but that's a kid to most of you, right? But when I came and did VBS here years ago, we did the book of James. So I know you did at least once, and you've probably done it more than that over your lifespan. And I know you've probably read these verses. And I want to ask you this basic question about these verses before we read them. I want to ask you, do you believe it? I'm not asking you whether you can understand what the words say. I'm asking, do you believe these words? If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. That's a sermon within itself. I'll try to preach the short version of it. But number one, do you believe that if you ask God for wisdom that he'll provide it? That's the first question. Because if we don't believe that to be true, if I don't believe that God can do that, then that's the first problem we have to work on, right? The rest of it is meaningless. The rest of the verses are meaningless if I don't believe he can do that. And so if you answered yes, I believe God can do that, then my next question is simply this. When's the last time you asked for wisdom? Here's the thing. We try to gain wisdom how? On our own. I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to figure out why my life has instability in it. I'm going to figure out what the problems are. I. How's that working out? I'll use a Mo Hafley phrase for you. Miss him? How's that working out for you? How well are we accomplishing things with this mindset? If any man lacks wisdom, if you're confused, if you're challenged, particularly about spiritual things and things of faith, ask God, who gives liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith. Let him be a believer in it. And don't doubt, because he won't receive anything, for he is a double-minded man. May I suggest to you this morning that sometimes the problem is not that God didn't or won't provide the wisdom. The problem generally lies in the fact that I don't like the wisdom offered. Sometimes the answer is simpler than we want it to be. Sometimes the simple wisdom that is offered in some cases is a simple yes or a no to something. We want more than that. God doesn't always provide more than that. Sometimes we want the answers to be measured by our human thought processes, and we want to frame them. And when it doesn't fit how we've already kind of framed up our thinking about things, then we wonder, did God even provide it at all? And the problem wasn't God, the problem was me. I believe God gives wisdom to all who ask him. I believe that he'll give it liberally. I believe he can use many mechanisms, any mechanism for that means, by which to do that. I believe ultimately that wisdom and knowledge obviously is given through the testimony of his word. But yet He might find many different ways to get that word into my heart and into my mind. He may use other people to come and teach and help me. He may encourage me to open my own Bible and study and meditate upon it. He may encourage me to spend more time in assemblies, to hear more and more of the wisdom expounded upon from His Word. There may be all kinds of ways that God's actually trying to give you the wisdom you're looking for. And yet, so often, we turn away from the very things that God's trying to do to grant unto us the wisdom that we lack. I can find stability in God. I can find stability. And I need to be praying more and more about it and preparing to receive the answers from His Word. He can provide strength of salvation to me. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1, for we know that if your earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. I know there are probably times, and there are folks sitting in this building this morning who feel like their tent is being worked on and worked on and worked on every day. And you may feel like that your physical tabernacle is waning. And may I invite you, as that process goes on, to just simply strengthen your hope and your faith in a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. That we might appreciate that all the physical things that challenge us are temporary. Though they may seemingly have been going on for a long period of time, in the grand scheme of things, they are temporary. Find stability in knowing there's something much better awaiting me in eternity. Verse 5, same chapter. Now He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who also has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, yes, well pleased, rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Don't you think about that concept in that text where sometimes we talk about for we walk by faith and not by sight, and maybe we don't talk enough about how that statement is made in the context in which it's said. It's said amidst this conversation about how the physical challenges that we're facing, and he contrasts that to the eternal hope that we have in the glory of God and the heaven that's awaiting us. So we walk by faith, not by sight. If I had to base my faith on my physical condition every day, how much faith would I have? Maybe not much, right? If my faith was being measured every day solely by how well I felt physically, then my faith wouldn't be very strong some days, would it? And he tells me that's why you don't walk by sight. If you walked by your way you saw your physical condition, if you were constantly consumed with the idea that the way you physically feel is a direct correlation to the way you spiritually feel, then we're going to be challenged. We don't walk that way. We walk by faith, not by sight. And so when I feel unstable physically, and certainly you can pray for help and encouragement and finding answers to physical ailment, but I'm trying to illustrate to us, don't let that be your measuring stick of faith. Because that will now not only, number one, you won't feel any better. Okay? Walking away from faith or leaving faith behind won't make you feel any physically better. So it doesn't help that. And now I don't have anything stabilizing my relationship with God either. Don't let Satan win both. Stability is often lost on the physical side, and many things out of our control, but stay focused in the stability of spiritual life that God grants to us. Because I want you to notice what hope can produce. Just go back one chapter, chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians, verse 16. Therefore we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. We have to keep our eyes upon the hope and promises that God provides. And those things cannot be seen in tangible form. And so we have to remind ourselves that the hope that we have can keep us anchored and keep us motivated even when we don't want to physically feel motivated. It reminds us of greater things that are on the horizon. And it can produce in us great conviction and great faith. And give us stability when physical life is offering me something to the contrary. And yet we ask the question, as I move to the last thought, if you're watching in your outlines in your bulletin. With all these promises God is making and all the effort that He does to provide us the wisdom and knowledge and the guidance and all the things to help us keep stable, then why are some still unstable? Why do I find myself unstable? And here maybe is the first part. Go back to that narrative in Isaiah 33. Because he said within that context that the fear of the Lord is necessary in this process. And to recognize what God is offering and to recognize that how I need to respect Him and honor Him and to appreciate His paths and His righteousness. And recognize that wisdom and knowledge start by first having a healthy dose of respect and fear of the Creator. In Proverb 1 and verse 7. In Proverb 1 and verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of the wisdom and knowledge that He's going to offer us. If you and I don't respect Him first, we won't listen to what He has to say. And you know that's true. You know how you know it's true? Because there are folks that you don't respect who have given you wisdom and guidance and you've thrown it out the window as soon as they said it. Right? If you don't fear God and love God and respect God and honor God and give Him all the praise and honor and glory that He deserves, I'll never listen to anything He has to say. And so that's why it's the beginning of wisdom. That's why the fear of the Lord is the starting place. And we need to recognize that when I reject His knowledge and His wisdom, I'm insulting Him. I'm insulting Him. In Proverb 9, verse 10. Again, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Stability can come, but we have to start with respect and fear of God. This fear of the Lord is necessary in finding God's approval. In Acts chapter 10, in verse 34, then Peter opened his mouth and said, "In truth I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation whoever fears Him and works righteousness is accepted by Him." I want the approval of God. I want Him to be a debilitating force in my life. I want God to help and guide and create some stability that I'm lacking in my life. The first step in that process is to fear and respect Him, because if it doesn't start there, the rest won't come. How much fear do I have of God? Will I seek that stability, I'll get it out in a minute, stabilizing growth that He extends? Notice one last passage with me. I just want to look at the Philippians text. Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. And you can look at the other text in Proverb later if you choose. But in Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, he said, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Fear is a stabilizer. Fear keeps me focused. Fear helps me recognize that God needs to be honored. Fear helps me recognize that His wisdom is greater than others. Fear helps me recognize that when God's path and my path are too different, then I need to choose His. Fear helps me recognize that when somebody tells me something contrary to what God has said, I need to listen to God. Fear is the beginning of the stabilizing process. You and I show the proper respect and honor to God. The result will be obedience no matter what others are doing. The result will be, even whether somebody who's watching me is present or not, I will remain obedient to the will of God. And may I offer at the close of our study this morning this thought. Ask yourself, if you feel like you're unstable in your spiritual walk, if you feel an instability in your spiritual life, then just ask a fair question. How much fear do I have of God? And if I don't fear Him much, then that might be the source of the problem. And if I do fear Him, how much effort do I make to listen to His wisdom and His guidance? He will be a stability to us. He will help stabilize the challenged and the perplexing things that we have in our hearts and our minds. But we have to let Him win. We have to let His wisdom and His knowledge be our choice and decision. Maybe you're subject in some way this morning. We can help you, encourage you to think about your relationship with God. You've yet to step out on His promises. You've yet to honor Him through obedience. There is no greater stabilizing choice that you can make than to be a child of God. It will bring benefit to you, and if you live faithful and you stay dedicated, it doesn't mean you won't have problems. It doesn't mean you won't have difficulties. It doesn't mean you might not get physically sick. What it means is you have the greatest equalizing force in your life that you ever had, and that is God. That's what it means. So will you honor Him today? Maybe you once done that. Step back into the world. We can help you, encourage you, strengthen you in some way to serve the Lord this day. We invite you to come even now while we stand, while we sing.